Well, I truly hope you enjoyed our session yesterday with Tina. But as I was praying and thinking about it, people need to see the historical structure of the church that President Washington prayed at. And where the Capitol was at this time when President Washington was inaugurated, okay? Washington, D.C. did not exist back in the time that our president was sworn in. On that inaugurational day, in April the 30th, 1789, when George Washington was sworn in, Washington, D.C. did not even exist. There was no Washington, D.C. as there is today. It was built later on. So therefore, the capital of the United States at this time was in New York, what we would know to become New York. And as I'm looking, I'm going to put some things down below in historical view to show you that this is true, historically documented, okay? It's not the imagination of somebody's mind. These things did happen. And being that nowadays in our school, God help our school, they don't teach history like they did when I was growing up. They don't even teach penmanship as far as writing in cursive anymore. They do it all by printing, which is the most stupidest thing I've ever seen. They say it's because of computers and the board key and all that stuff. Well, the kids need to be taught both, okay? Our learning system is become very ignorant. I helped homeschool a girl one time, a few years back, and they don't even teach science like they used to. What is up with that? Come on, people. Anyway, the chapel of St. Paul that was there at Ground Zero, let me read a little bit to you. It's a chapel of the parish of Trinity Church. St. Paul was built on land granted by Queen Anne of Great Britain. Tying us kind of back into Great Britain, at that time, she gave land and granted it to this church. And Andrew Gautier served as master craftsman. Upon completing in the 1766, it stood in a field some distance from the growing port city in the south, and that would be New York. It was built on a chapel of ease for parishioners who live far from the mother church. In other words, they lived too far from the main church, so they built this chapel so that people could go there that really couldn't get to the main church. Built of Manhattan with brownstone quarry. St. Paul's has the classic PRORTICO box perimeter and dimensions detailed that are characteristic of Georgiana churches such as James Gibbons, London Church of St. Martin in the Fields, after which it was modeled. Its original tower, raised from a square base, is topped by a replica monument of Lysicrates. And so you can read all of this. Go down and read it. But the most important thing, George Washington, along with the members of the United States Congress, that means the House of Representatives, the Senate, and all these people on the of Congress, worshipped at St. Paul's Chapel on his inauguration day on April the 30th, 1789. Washington also attended services at St. Paul's during the 2 years New York City was the country's capital. So New York was our country's capital for 2 years. Above Washington's pew, the pew that he sat in the chapel, is an 18th century oil painting of the Great Seal of the United States, adopted in 1782. The chapel contains several monuments and memorials that assist to its elevational state in early New York. A monument to Richard Morgan, hero of the Battle of Quebec, sculpted by whatever that name is, read it, in 1777. George Washington's original pew and non-BAROQUE script called Glory, designed by Pierre. Sounds like a Frenchman. Anyway, the design of Washington, D.C., the pulpit is surmounted by a coronet and 6 feathers and 14 original cut glass hung in the nave in the gallery. So this was the concentration. They consecrated America, a new birth country, newly born. The new president that was just elected went down with the members of the United States Congress, and that means the House and the representatives of Congress, the Senate, and all the men that were importance, that founded, that made the Constitution, that made, that there be a House of Representatives and Congress and the presidency. They all went down to St. Paul's Chapel and they prayed. They prayed. And they dedicated and consecrated this nation to God. Now, did they live to be holy men and they lived and walked in perfection of God? Of course not. They were men. But that's not the basis of how they lived their lives. It's what they did. They consecrated and dedicated this nation to God. They got the foundations. They building the foundations of this nation and laying the foundations to God when they did this act. You know, Israel was consecrated and dedicated to God, and they accepted it at Mount Sinai. When God spoke, they accepted it. Also, at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, they dedicated and they consecrated Israel to God. It wasn't so much how the people lived that made them so holy. It's what they did in consecrating their land to God. Just like George Washington and the United States Congress, they said, okay, this land is yours. We dedicate it to you, God. You are the foundation of this country. When we do that, we take on a big obligation. A big obligation. So when September the 11th, 2001 come along, those towers set on a field that once was a field, and it belonged to the church. At one time, Manhattan down there, where those twin towers stood and those buildings stood, belonged to the Church of St. Paul, where George Washington dedicated America to God and laid the foundations. So when the judgment come, when the hedge was taken down and the walls were breached and those terrorists came and flew those planes into those buildings, with God's judgment, see, God used human beings to perfect his judgment on people and upon nations. He did it to Israel when Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, come in, destroyed the first temple, burnt the city, destroyed people, killed them, and then took the king of Israel and the people as captivity. And the very last thing that king seen, because Jeremiah had prophesied to them and told them, if you do not repent, this judgment of God is going to come up on you, and you're going to be punished for your rebellion and you worshiping idols that are not pleasing and are not of God. And they would not believe him at all. So what happened? Nebuchadnezzar's troops marched in, destroyed the city, destroyed the temple, took all the gold and stuff, and took the king, killed his family, his children, before his very eyes, and put out his eyes. Then we see on down the road, because God permitted Israel to come back, after 75 weeks, they come back. They were able to rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple there on Mount Moriah, and was there when Yeshua, Jesus, was born, and was there when he was crucified. Now, of course, Jesus, Yeshua, prophesied that the temple would be destroyed again. Because, why? Of their wickedness. He told the scribes and Pharisees, not one stone would be left upon another. It would be totally destroyed. And that the judgment of God was going to fall upon that generation for every death, from the very time of Abel all the way up to every prophet that Israel themselves killed and the innocent blood shed. And it was all around the innocent blood being shed that the second temple would come down, and that generation in particularly would suffer for it all. For it all the way back to Abel when Cain killed him. But they would put a cap on their judgment when Yeshua HaMashiach was killed, and they rejected him. So 70 years after Yeshua's death, Rome walked in, slaughtered the people, slaughtered their walls. The hedge was taken down, the walls were breached, and they walked in. They slaughtered the people. They slaughtered them so much that they had to crawl over dead bodies. And they burnt the holy temple to the ground, destroyed it, crushed it, and they scattered the people, the children of Israel, to the four winds of the earth. They would not let them have it. They took the land from them. They gave it to the Palestinians that never did anything with it. The land, the city, the whole thing was in a ruinous heap. And nothing was there. Mark Twain went there and said, it's nothing there. I mean, you know, it's terrible. There's nothing there. Nothing grows here. It's just a ruinous heap, he said. And it was that way until 1948, when God finally relinquished and let Israel come back. The same circumstances is multiplying and coming to America. And this is why New York, right there at ground zero, was hit by the terrorists. This is why the hedge of protection was taken down there and the wall was breached, because this place was the capital of the United States of America at this time. For 2 years it was the capital of the United States of America, because Washington, D.C. did not exist. And that chapel played a very major act in the Constitution of the United States, of the inauguration of George Washington, and the dedication of our nation to God. Because George Washington led the Congress. He led the United States Congress, the men that represented it, down to let me see who this may be. Hello? Hello? Don't want it, thank you. Anyway, he led them to this chapel to pray and dedicate this newly born nation that he had just become president, had just spoken his inaugurational speech there, and he led them to this chapel where they would pray and dedicate this nation to God. Didn't matter whether they lived perfect life, it's what they did on that inaugurational day. Their act laid the foundation of America being founded to God and His principles. Hello? Yes? Okay, wait a minute. Let me end this real quick, okay? I'm on a video. Hang on. So, I am putting the links to this dedication that George Washington did himself. If you don't want to believe that this was judgment upon America on September the 11th in 2012, and you don't want to know that you must repent and come back to God to stay off the final and major judgment that God's going to pour down on America, you need to go back in history and read. I'm going to put the links up there below. And it is important that you understand that this nation was dedicated and given to God in that little chapel at Ground Zero. And that's why God protected it that day when the towers went down, and that little sycamore tree saved that church, to remind you of what George Washington and the United States Congress did that day. It does not matter how they lived their life. It does matter exactly what they did that day in their action of dedicating to God. And the same dedication is still there. So on September the 11th, 2001, the hedge was taken down. The hedge of protection was taken down. The walls were breached. And if we do not repent and come back to God and His ordinances, the main and final judgment will fall on America. Please, people, wake up and pray in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen. To become New York. And as I'm looking, I'm going to put some things down below in historical view to show you that this is true, historically documented, okay? It's not the imagination of somebody's mind. These things did happen. And being that nowadays in our school, God help our school, they don't teach history like they did when I was growing up. They don't even teach penmanship as far as writing in cursive anymore. They do it all by printing, which is the most stupidest thing I've ever seen. They say it's because of computers and the board key and all that stuff. Well, the kids need to be taught both, okay? Well, I truly hope you enjoyed our session yesterday with Tina. But as I was praying and thinking about it, people need to see the historical structure of the church that President Washington prayed at. 30th, 1789, when George Washington was sworn in. Washington, D.C. did not even exist. There was no Washington, D.C. as there is today. It was built later on. So therefore, the capital of the United States at this time was in New York. What we would know, and where the capital was at this time when President Washington was inaugurated, okay? Washington, D.C. did not exist back in the time that our president was sworn in. On that inaugurational day, in April the